philosopher by training, but what fascinates me about architecture is that that's a realm in which all of our high-flying theories about humanity have to be built in a way that we actually inhabit. And it's kind of a fascinating way of testing our theories and discovering, were we right about this? Have we understood ourselves effectively, or have we got a really bad idea going here? Once you pour that out in concrete form, it kind of becomes obvious pretty quickly. So I want to try to tell the story of the change that we often talk of in terms of postmodernism in architecture. But there are so many different ways of telling that story that I've decided to kind of focus the story by thinking about the dialogue between different theories of humanity, the different buildings and cities that we have built, and pandemics. It feels like a timely topic to think about the way in which diseases have shaped buildings and cities and the homes that we inhabit, and the ways those have changed over time. So we're going to do a whirlwind tour through 2 centuries of disease and design is the plan for this evening. Before we dive right into that, I want to get a couple of sort of terminology and theoretical frames in place. The first word I want to introduce to you here is a fun one to say, palimpsest. I don't know if you've encountered this word before, but it's a word that actually refers to old manuscripts. When you're researching medieval writings, when they wrote using vellum or parchment or something, paper and those kind of writing materials were in incredibly short supply. So they would often reuse something that they had written on before. They would use a knife and scrape off the ink that had been previously applied to the page and then write something new on it. So the term to refer to those layers of ink on the page is palimpsest. You can sort of see what used to be there, but you can see what they're trying to do now too at the same time, right? There's sort of layers of meaning, layers of history building up as they use and reuse these manuscript pages. And I want you to think about cities as a form of palimpsest. There's layers to our cities, right? Roads might remain in the same place, but the buildings on those roads change from decade to decade. The same building might get a facelift or an interior redesign. So this image that I've shown you here, you can see some rather old buildings here, some slightly newer ones and some very new ones going up. And sometimes in the city, you can see the raw edge of where they knocked down part of a building, tried to finish off the edge of where something else attached to it, right? So if we look at the cities around us through that lens, we can see the layers of history and the sort of conversation about humanity that unfolds in brick and mortar, concrete, and stone. So we'll be kind of reading the palimpsest of our history in relation to disease. One other thing to note before we get started is that cultural change is never as nice and tidy as historians make it sound, right? Historians and philosophers, we like labels like modern, postmodern, medieval, Renaissance. The Renaissance didn't happen on a Wednesday morning when people woke up and you're like, I think we're done being medieval. Let's try something new. How about a rebirth? It's obviously a very slow change over a long period of time across many different aspects of our shared culture. So I like to think of cultural change more like a fraying rope. So this image that I've given you here, think of a fiber rope with just lots of increasing pressure in opposite directions. And one by one, those little fibers start to break and you start to see some things change kind of dramatically, whereas other things stay connected and they're not all that much different than they used to be. So as we look at this transition from modern to postmodern, we'll look at both what sort of stays connected as well as what breaks. And then I want us to think about our present moment in those terms as well. We're under a lot of pressure right now. This pandemic has revealed a lot of things to us. It has changed a lot of things for us. What do we think is going to stay connected through this? And what do we think is going to break under the pressure? It's a conversation I'd like us to have toward the end of our time together. All right, so let's dive right in. Like I said, 2 centuries of disease and design. If we go back into the 1800s, there were just successive waves of pandemics and epidemics. There was cholera, there was typhus, there was influenza, there was tuberculosis. And No one really understood how these spread and how to prevent that spread. And the prevailing theory for a lot of these was that they were airborne. So the stinkier the air, the more likely it was to be contagious. And so the best thing you could do was somehow protect the air around yourself by making it smell good, right? So carry flowers or something, and this would somehow protect you. Of course, we know now that in many of these cases, it was the fact that they were dumping sewage out their windows and into the streets where it ran in open trenches into the rivers from which they pulled their drinking water, right? So once they kind of cracked that code, a lot changed about the design of cities and our shared living space. There were major investments in infrastructures. There were redesigns of whole cities and individual buildings. There were changing attitudes toward technology. So for instance, in London, cholera was a constant plague. There was constant debate over how to remedy this. And eventually the Great Stink of 1858, presented here in this editorial etching, is when the Thames River was so putrid and so full of sewage that there was nowhere in the city you couldn't smell it. And people were finally like, you know, maybe we should try to do something about that. And major sewers were installed underneath the city of London. And by 1866, 8 years later after the Great Stink, they had a new sewage system. There was a new cholera outbreak in 1867, and everyone fared quite well except the neighborhoods of East London, which were not yet connected to the sewers. Cholera raged out of control in East London. Everywhere else, it was fairly well controlled. And so people were like, okay, maybe these major infrastructure projects are worth the investment. In Paris, same story. Major battles with typhus, with cholera, with other epidemics. And this fine fellow, George Eugene Haussmann, took it upon himself to redesign the entire city of Paris in order to fight cholera. So if you've been to Paris and seen some of the older neighborhoods that survived Haussmann's revisions of the city, you'll see these narrow, winding cobblestone streets. This is what medieval Paris looked like all across the city. Some of it was quite unsanitary. Again, the same thing is happening in London with raw sewage being dumped in open waterways and so forth. Haussmann, if you've been to London, Paris these days, you know it's these giant sunlit boulevards, big fountains, intersecting rays of lines of the streets coming into the center of the city. And his theory was sunlight, ventilation, these were fundamental to combating disease. And so if we redesign the city and remove these kind of narrow, meandering neighborhoods and build out these broad avenues where the wind can blow freely and sunlight can pour in, the city will be healthier. Now, it doesn't hurt that at the same time they started installing sewers and drinking water systems. And so they did manage to improve the conditions of the disease. What's interesting in both the case of London and in Paris is that it wasn't just about disease. There was also a question of social class. There was a suspicious attitude toward the poor, toward immigrants, toward other populations. So if you've seen Les Mis, for example, you remember the barricades scenes, right? It's harder to build a barricade in these giant boulevards in Paris. They were designed wide enough to prevent that sort of small-scale neighborhood combat that had characterized the French Revolution and other uprisings in Paris's history. And it made it easier to line up cannons in the center of these fountain-filled plazas and aim them down all of the rays of the streets that converged there. And so from one strategic location, you could control major avenues of the city. It was a military fortification strategy in addition to a disease eradication strategy. In London, again, the neighborhoods that got connected to the sewers were the wealthy ones. They were the ones connected to political power. Those at the margins of society remained at the margins of the healthcare infrastructure as well. So I want us to keep an eye on that dynamic as we unfold this story going forward. In New York City, same sort of story. Tenement housing, people jammed into incredibly close quarters without sunlight, without windows, without ventilation, shared outhouses that had to be scooped out by sanitation workers on the regular basis, shared by about 30 people per stall every day, and about 100,000 horses in the city, dropping 3 million pounds of manure per day. So again, imagine the sanitation concerns. It was in the midst of that a guy that we know from Shelburne here in Vermont, Frederick Law Olmsted, designed Central Park. He's the guy who designed Shelburne Farms, which is not just a natural environment, it's a cultivated gardenscape. He was employed up here by the Vanderbilt family to do that. But he also built Central Park, Prospect Park. These are not just natural environments. They're actually intentionally planned parkways. And he called them the lungs of the city. The city needs to breathe. It's too toxic, there's too much tuberculosis. Even though they, by the point this park was started, understood the role of water and sewer in the conveyance of these diseases, it was still believed that more air was going to be healthy. And that way of thinking was once again used to characterize immigrant communities in New York City. An Italian community on the Lower East Side between the two bridges was known as the lung block, simply because the density of population there was so intense that it was believed that these kind of diseases which affected the lungs were started there and spread from there to the rest of the city. And so that kind of argumentation was used to destroy those neighborhoods entirely and build some of the first public housing complexes. This is Knickerbocker Village, which now occupies the site of the former Italian immigrant community in that area of New York City. This building still stands, but it was roughly 12 times more expensive to live in, even though it was considered low-income housing for the time. It was far more expensive than the housing that the Italian community had at that point. And so they had to go elsewhere. Instead, middle-class white families moved into the neighborhood, and it's only increased in value over the years. Today, it's a heavily fortified, gated community. There are gardens inside these walls, and you have to have a facial recognition scan to access the building today. And of course, if you followed anything about these technologies, you know that there's great concern over the effectiveness of these. They track the faces of white people far more effectively than people of color. There are biases sort of built into the algorithms that govern these things. So notice the trend here, right? Again, disease hits. We use the disease to raise concerns about the health and safety of our neighborhoods. We displace the people we think are the carriers of those disease. We build new, better, cleaner, healthier, more pure environments in those spaces and then fortify them and control access to them, right? This pattern repeats over and over through history. One last example from the 19th century. That's the city of Chicago. Chicago, famous for its stockyards at this time, where thousands upon thousands of cows and pigs were slaughtered every day for transport on refrigerated trains around the country. This is where Oscar Mayer and Swift and some of these names that are now household names got their fortunes started. Well, again, they're just dumping everything into the rivers, which flow into Lake Michigan, which is where they get their drinking water. So they undertook this massive technological project and jacked up the entire city of Chicago without disturbing anyone who was occupying the buildings. So here's the Briggs Hotel, giant, I think 6-story building. People are in there eating lunch, and all around the perimeter of the building are men with jacks who on the whistle blow it, on the whistle blow, turn it a quarter, and the building ekes up inch by inch by inch. They jacked the whole place up by about 20 feet, laid sewer pipes, and solved some of their sanitation problem that way. However, the sewer pipes still dumped into the river, which still dumped into Lake Michigan. So then they thought, okay, we need to solve this problem. They hired Ellis Chesbrough, the guy who built Boston's T transportation system. He came out to Chicago. They employed immigrant labor to dig a 2-mile tunnel underneath Lake Michigan out to this intake 2 miles offshore, which flows by tunnel to the famous water tower there on Michigan Avenue, You've seen that. And they thought, there we go, problem solved. Well, guess what? Spring rains, heavy floods, the sewage flows right out 2 miles offshore, gets sucked into the intake. Now the water tower is full of sewage. Problem not solved. But they did not give up. Chesbrough said, I can do one better. And he actually reversed the natural flow of the Chicago River by dredging it deeper in the opposite direction using steam shovels. It was, instead of flowing into Lake Michigan, they built a huge canal and gradually tapered the river until eventually it reversed flow into the Mississippi, and they sent all their sewage downriver to St. Louis. At last, Chicago's healthcare system is solved. They have fresh drinking water 24/7. Their sewage goes somewhere else. They don't need to know where. And everyone's happy, unless you live in St. Louis, right? So what's fascinating about this, and this is what I want you to hold on to from these examples, is that they relied on technology to solve these problems without requiring any change of behavior and without threatening economic growth, right? Jack up the city, send the sewage to someone else, let us continue with life undisturbed. And we'll see that dynamic roll into the 20th century and even to the present day. So here we are in Rio de Janeiro, as they were building up their infrastructure to host the Olympics a few years back. They have a giant slum problem. The favelas are impoverished, filled with, there's no running water or sewer systems there, disease, crime, so forth. Rather than fixing those before they hosted the world, they simply built a giant pretty wall around them so you can't see them, and carried on celebrating their Olympic spirit. So as we roll into the 20th century, that mindset is carrying the day. Electricity has come into mass production. Light bulbs. Thomas Edison's invention is further refined by Lewis Howard Latimer, who you see here. He's the one who gave us carbon filaments instead of fiber-based filaments that Edison was working with, which allowed for long life mass production bulbs. So now we have electric street lights employed in our cities. We have the factory assembly line process developed by Henry Ford for the production of the Model T. Incidentally, he actually learned how to do this in Chicago at the meat slaughterhouse production lines. They were called disassembly lines. And he was fascinated by how quickly they could kill and package a pig. And he went and studied them and kind of reverse engineered that to build cars. So mass production is on the horizon. Electrification is on the horizon. In architecture, steel frame architecture is the new order of building. Instead of just stacking up stones, which require your base to be proportionally thicker to carry all the weight, so your building walls are sort of trapezoidal, they build a steel skeleton and then just surround it with stone. And you can build much taller with much less weight, with much smaller footprint. And so these are some of the earliest steel frame skyscrapers that you're seeing here. The one in the middle is in New York City, was built in 1870. This one over here was built in 1884 in Chicago. This one, the Wainwright Building, in 1891 in St. Louis. These were technological marvels. And so people in the early 20th century were completely high on technology. We were going to solve every one of our problems through electricity, factory production, steel, all these amazing new tools that we had at our disposal. Some of the artists who celebrated that were known as the Futurists. So here you can see a painting by Giacomo Balla. It's a street light rendered as though it's a religious icon. It sort of pulses with this holy aura that we might have previously associated with the Virgin Mary in a Byzantine painting. Umberto Boccioni's The City Rises. Look at the frenetic energy. Think of a busy city plaza with people rushing to and fro with horse-drawn carriages. In the background, you can see some of those steel frame architecture buildings going up. There's this relentless optimism that the future is nothing but continuous improvement and technological marvels left and right. And of course, we know what happens very soon. After Henry Ford starts his Model T factory in 1913, the very next year, that mass production apparatus is used to design tanks and guns and bombs and implements of destruction. So this landscape artist, Paul Nash, recorded the transformation of Europe's landscape during the First World War. It's a menacing look. For someone who carries so much optimism about what technology will do for us, it's hard to figure this out. The futurists were undeterred. They celebrated this. For them, a machine gun was a holy icon. A screaming automobile that sounded like a machine gun was one of their most favorite things. And in fact, they went so far as to say, war is the world's only hygiene. These are artists who embraced war as a way of cleansing the planet. So see this as this exacerbated version of the impulses that were already there in addressing cholera in the century before. To blame another population, move them out, eradicate them, send your sewage down the river, clean your own place out, right? Let's do this on a global scale. Right in the middle of this is when what we now call the Spanish flu hits, along with further pandemics of polio and other major diseases. If you live in a house built during that time, like I do, my house here in Burlington was built in 1922. The radiators in my house are huge. If they all run, it gets hot. And that's because they were designed too big because they expected everyone to have their windows open. So every house built for about 10 years after the infamous Spanish flu everyone assumed that you had your windows open all winter because you needed that ventilation to purify your space. This was the same year that New York City implemented a ban on spitting in public as a public hygiene method. So while this war is raging, so too disease is raging, and people are trying to figure out from the small scale of the size of the radiators in your house to public policies like spitting bans to what do we do about the war. And it's all spiraling out of control at this point. And so this sculpture here by Wilhelm Lembruck captures it nicely, I think. The sense of where humanity finds itself at this moment. Just contrast this to this famous statue, Michelangelo's David. How would you describe the 1915 statue in comparison to David? What adjectives come to mind? It's always a little awkward on Zoom.
Very, very underfed.
Yeah, malnourished.
Oh, man.
Defeated.
Defeated. I heard something else that I didn't quite catch.
Well, it's the decline of all these this great promise.
Absolutely. Notice how the head is the lowest part of the body, whereas in Michelangelo's sculpture, the head is all the way up there and it's oversized. He intentionally violated the canonical rules for the size of body parts in relation to each other. The hands are too big and the head is too big. There's a lot of debate over what this means. Is it about viewing angles, or is it metaphorical for his intellectual capacity and his physical capacity to care for himself, and by implication, the city of Florence's ability to care for itself? Whatever sort of hubris there is in David is gone in this other statue. Emaciated, defeated. Look, notice the arc of the body is sort of down to that low head, right? So coming out of the world wars, the sort of collective sense amongst architects and artists, and indeed epidemiologists for that matter, is what happened? How in the name of enlightenment did we become so barbaric? And how do we prevent this from happening again? Now, again, there's lots of stories to tell here. There's all kinds of different artistic movements that come out of this moment. I'm not going to take the time to trace all of those lines. I want to keep the focus on the one that is reacting in a sort of disease model to this. And that's the ones listed at the bottom. The Bauhaus School of Design, a collection of artists called De Stijl, which is simply Dutch for the style, and then what becomes known as the international style of design and architecture. These movements kind of coalesce around a common thinking about war and other social problems as a disease that can be eradicated with the right sort of design. So you've probably seen paintings like this, Piet Mondrian. He was a part of the De Stijl movement. And he thinks what he's doing in a painting like this is reducing all of the subjective differences that we bring to political debates or religious differences or just preferences for food or what have you, He's getting rid of all of those and giving us objective reality. And for Mondrian, objective reality is math, straight lines, right angles, primary colors. That is what is objective. That is what is real. And if we could all just rally around some math and science, we could make this world a better place. So Gerrit Rietveld believes this and actually designs a house that is sort of a three-dimensional Mondrian painting. Notice this is 1924. I don't know about you, but when I sort of think in a mental map of architecture and I think of buildings from the 20s, this is not the first thing that comes to mind. I think, Edwardian or something more ornate, but this is very stripped down to primary colors, purity of forms. Theo van Doesburg, an artist who was part of this movement, said this: "The square is for us as the cross was for early Christians." Just think about that for a minute, what a cross symbolizes for a devout Christian, whether it's worn on a chain around their neck or it's at the front of a church. It symbolizes an entire way of life, right? An ethics, an example to follow, a goal for which to aspire. And they said the square is that for us. It's balanced, it's symmetrical, it's mathematical. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter your race or your gender. A square is a square is a square, right? Geometry doesn't change according to national identity. So they think, here's our source of unity. We tore ourselves apart in the world wars over our subjective differences of nation and language and religion and all of this. No more. Let's unite around what we actually have in common. So the Bauhaus school was one of the first to take up this challenge. This was a group, it's actually a merger of a fine arts school and a design school in 1919. This is the building they built for themselves in 1925 in Dessau, Germany. They occupied that until 1932 when they fled the rise of the Nazis and came to America, actually. And you can see it bears those structural similarities to that Rietveld house and to the Mondrian painting. They believed, one of their statements was this: machines will lead to a new order of work and of leisure. So they were all about mass production according to rational principles. So they believed they could design prototypes of perfect utilizations of form that would then be able to be mass produced using modern techniques and materials, so that all of us would be sitting on the same furniture, all of us would be living in the same house, driving the same cars, toasting our toast with the same toasters, wearing the same clothes, using the same fonts, et cetera, et cetera. They designed everything. And you've seen Bauhaus fonts, for example. And you've no doubt seen designs influenced by these approaches. IKEA is full of them. Target is full of them. There are plenty of stores for which now mid-century modern is their design motif. And that's really what Bauhaus wanted. They thought they were designing pure forms, perfect prototypes, and the more houses that were filled with them, the better the world will be. And here's one of their luminaries, Le Corbusier, French architect, said this: "We must create the mass production spirit, the spirit of constructing mass production houses, the spirit of living in mass production houses. We shall arrive at the house machine, the mass production house, healthy and morally healthy too, and beautiful in the same way as the working tools and instruments that accompany our existence are beautiful." So you want beauty? Get it from purity of form, and it will make you healthy. It's not an accidental correlation there. Again, they're thinking of the problems that were manifested on the battlefields of Europe as a disease to be eradicated through public works, through design, through architecture, in the way that cholera and other things had been combated in the century before. This carried over into actual healthcare. So here's a sanatorium. This was one of the most popular ways of treating tuberculosis. You were taken out to the countryside and convalesced in an area where you had access to open air, and you were also quarantined off from the rest of the population, so you couldn't infect them. So here's one designed in Finland by a husband and wife, whose names I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but you can see it partakes of that purity of form. It has balconies, almost a cruise ship sort of feeling to it. bright colors, big open windows, lots of cross ventilation. This thing was designed top to bottom, from the door handles to the lights, and everything in between was thought of as a way in which the building itself would heal the people who inhabited it. And the designers of the Bauhaus and their successors were paying attention to this. And so what you'll start to see is a sort of hospitalization of household design. The black and white photo here is a Victorian era bathroom. Notice all the wood. This is fabric on the walls. They would have rugs on the floor and wood floors, upholstered furniture. These are things that are not typical for our bathrooms today. Our bathrooms are about hard surfaces, cleanable surfaces, right? That shift starts to happen at this time. So here's a bathroom designed by Le Corbusier, and you can see it's all tile. It kind of looks like a health spa or something. The idea is that we need surfaces that are more easily cleaned, and that move us away from this reliance on this crusty old stuff, which is impure for Le Corbusier. So he said this: he wants us to think of the house as a machine. He says the machine we're currently living in is an old coach full of tuberculosis. All these junk piled rooms in a Victorian home, big gaudy gilt framed paintings on the wall, heavy drapes and rugs, wicker furniture, floral arrangements. Get it all out. It's accumulating dust. It's contributing to disease. So purify, simplify, minimalize your life. And that is modern architecture and modern interior design. So here it is visibly on display in his Villa Savoie, designed in 1928, completed in 1931. You can see the pure white concrete, the way it floats on these pilasters, almost weightless seeming. He actually thought this was a healthy thing. It was protected from the humidity of the soil this way. And the interior is a lot of glass. He thought a lot about the ratio of sunlight and wind coming into these spaces, and designed movable partitions to open the interior to the outside. And he said, teach your children that a house is only habitable when it is full of light and air, and when the floors and walls are clear. So get rid of the junk and purify your life. He was so intent on hygiene that this is the front door of the house. Actually, that's the back door. The front door is you're sort of standing here. The first thing you encounter when walking into the house is a freestanding sink. It's not a bathroom. It's like, wash your hands before you go one more step. This spawned a whole movement of what we now call the powder room. If you live in a house where there's a small half bath near the front door of the house, it's because of this hygiene concern in the modern era. This house by Alfred Loos in Prague. Loos defined civilization as progress toward greater cleanliness. This is the Villa Müller, and it has a special room for quarantining children when they get sick, designed into the floor plan. Just the expectation this is going to happen, and we're going to need to address it architecturally. So there's this progression toward tiled surfaces, toward white walls, toward impervious materials like concrete. And think of white as that signifier of cleanliness, right? A white wall isn't necessarily any more clean than a wooden one. The white coats that doctors wear don't make anything more hygienic. Why do we associate those with hygiene and cleanness? In part, it's a class issue again, right? The wealthier you were, the more access you had to cleaning options for your white linen clothing. And that's why fashions of the time pushed the white objects of clothing out to the visibility, so that if you were wealthy enough to clean your clothes, you wanted to flaunt that, whereas the poor wallowed in their uncleanness. As this progresses through the mid-century, you can see that relentless push toward purification of form. This house is almost nothing, right? Glass walls, cantilevered ceiling and floor, floating above the grass, no foundation, no basement, just purity of form. This is the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe. He was part of the Bauhaus who fled to the US. The United Nations was built at this time. Think about what that symbolizes, right? This is a hope to solve the world's problems through diplomacy and rationality. The clarity of the glass windows bespeaks rationality, transparency, a commitment to honesty and purity. in our dealings with one another. So contrast this approach to war to the futurists for whom war is the world's hygiene. So get rid of the scum. Here it is. We can figure out a better solution through rational design. Mies van der Rohe designed these famous apartments on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago. So this is scalable, right? From the individual dwelling to now apartment complexes. And it becomes the de facto visual vocabulary of corporate architecture. There was so much rebuilding after World War II. 60% of the city of Warsaw had been obliterated by bombing. In Germany, 333 square kilometers of urban environment had been obliterated. 2.5 million housing units were destroyed in Germany alone. In Japan, more than 710,000 buildings had been destroyed. There's a lot of building to do. And this becomes the way in which these places are rebuilt. So this one is the headquarters of Union Carbide in New York City. And the entire building is based on a repeating pattern of rectangles, 2.5 by 5. Everything from the basic building panels of the large scale structure, down to the individual window panels, down to the ceiling tiles, down to the partition walls. This is the secretary's pools. The desks are 2.5 by 5 feet. The Rolodex, the telephone, everything is the same repeating mathematical ratio from small scale all the way up. Again, purity of form will improve our working lives. Again, this is used as an argument for clearing slums, for relocating populations deemed unclean, so that these large-scale projects can be built up. We're getting close to the moment at which this changes and we get to the postmodern. But it takes something to reveal the inherent problems in this. And one of the projects that really brought that revelation about for a lot of people was this housing project in St. Louis called Pruitt-Igoe. It was designed in 1951, constructed and fully completed by 1956. Designed by Hellmuth and Yamasaki. Yamasaki went on to design the Twin Towers in New York City, the ones that were felled on 9/11. He was awarded major architectural prizes for this housing project in New York, in St. Louis. This was the city of the future. St. Louis had a housing shortage, it had a racial problem, it had economic disparities, and these buildings were meant to solve all of those. They were modular in their construction. Come back to that in just a second. So they were fairly cheaply built by comparison to many other projects of the day. There were 33 identical 11-story towers housing 12,000 residents of St. Louis. They replaced some truly abysmal slum environments. So it's certainly the case that there was a problem to solve here. Here's what the completed project looked like from the air. Just massive, right? The theory was that these would be towers in a park. There'd be this giant green lawn for acres, and then these towers would sort of float above them on pilasters, like that Villa Savoye house. And these would be humanizing, healing environments. Rich and poor would live here, black and white would live here. It would overcome the diseases which divide us because it was such rational design. The areas in which the elevators emerged into the upper floors and the apartment doors opened up were conceived of as streets in the sky, where neighbors would gather, community would form. You can see June Cleaver is there, I think, with her baby carriage. There's a tricycle, there's greenery, there's sunlight. It's like taking that French house that we looked at, the Villa Savoye, and just stacking it up over and over to house 12,000 people. Well, in reality, that's what the space built actually looked like. And within just a few years, this is what it looked like. They implemented some design schemes here. They thought, let's be rationally efficient. Not every elevator has to stop at every floor, right? So if you need to go to the 4th through the 7th floor, get on this elevator. If you need to go on the 8th through the 11th floor, get on that elevator, and so on, right? Well, just imagine that you live in, this apartment, and you step off your elevator, and there's someone there waiting to mug you. Even if you evade the crime, or maybe you were victimized by it, you get into your apartment, you call the police. How long is it going to take the police, come back, to figure out which building you're in, which entrance to that building they should take to find the elevator that goes to your floor and get off in the right, like the criminals are gone, right? And any smart criminal quickly realizes this, and these become havens for crime and violence. Within a year's time, even the most impoverished residents of Pruitt-Igoe are trying to move out. The lawn between the buildings in which these towers would loom never materialized. The towers cast too much shadow. So in 1972, these buildings were demolished completely. And the architecture critic Charles Jenks said, modern architecture died around 3:32 in the afternoon on July 15th, 1972. It's when we saw the problems with this way of thinking. Buildings alone cannot heal us. We need to do something different. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip this next example and talk about what comes after. And then I want us to talk about where we are right now in an open discussion. Modernists believe that there's a one-size-fits-all to our problems. That reason and technology will help us find this just in the same way as they've helped us find vaccines for diseases and so forth. And purity is the goal, just like it is in the realm of disease. The problems revealed in Pruitt-Igoe and other places is that one-size-fits-all doesn't account for human diversity. Usually it's a privileged white male Western architect designing the world to fit himself. For instance, Le Corbusier designed rooms where the bedrooms for children were about the size of a closet because he personally hated children. But this is a one-size-fits-all universal solution for humanity, right? We've come to realize that reason and technology are great servants, but terrible masters. They're just parts of our humanity they don't fully account for, right? We have stories and music and things for a reason. And purity is an illusion. Everything we do is contaminated. In fact, the best things that we have about ourselves come from that cross-contamination with one another. Like take Italian food. Pasta was invented in China. It was imported to Italy by Marco Polo. Like we can't think of Italian culture without spaghetti, but we wouldn't have spaghetti if it weren't for the Chinese. That's contamination, right? Cultures intermingling. If we held off our walls of purity, some of the best things in the world just wouldn't exist. So with these realizations, postmodern architects were like, let's mix it up. Let's make contaminated stuff on purpose. Screw purity. Let's have fun. Let's make a mess. They took inspiration from places like Las Vegas, where everything is just glitzy and glammy and in bad taste. The buildings really aren't all that different from one another, except in terms of the lights and signs they put on the front, right? So Robert Venturi wrote a book called Learning from Las Vegas, and he said, less isn't more, which was one of the famous mantras of modern architecture. Less is a bore. So let's do something we haven't done for a while. He designed this house for his mother in Philadelphia. It's a very flat house. It's almost like a billboard, one room deep. And if you'll notice, it looks like, if you asked a child, draw a house, they'd draw you something kind of like this, right? It's got that central gable. It's got a chimney coming out. It's got a door in the middle and windows on each side. He's obviously played with the formula, but it's like it's a billboard for a house that says, I'm a house, in a way that a modern building, it's the same glass box, whether it's an office or a house or a church or a store, it's a glass box. It's the same rectangle. And Venturi said, no, we need our buildings to talk to us, right? Tell us something about what they are. As this thinking expands, there's buildings that make references to the past. So this is a Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, designed for an Italian community there. Has all these references to Italy's history and culture. It has all different building materials. Neon and stainless steel are there with marble and granite. There are cartoonish busts of the architects along with busts of Roman emperors, all kinds of things going on there. Imagine you could guess who owns this building if you look closely. It's the Disney Team building in Burbank, California. And you can see it's like a Greek temple. It makes these historical references to ancient Greek architecture, but the caryatids, the figures holding up the pediment structure of the temple, which would have been human forms in Greek architecture, are the seven dwarfs. It's playful, tells you something about it. You couldn't look at that building and say, I wonder who owns that. Like, it tells you right up front. Symbolism, historical reference, color, texture, playfulness. This building was designed for AT&T, now owned by Sony. It's designed to look like a giant bureau, like a dresser drawer set, right? Like a Chippendale top there. Because what is AT&T? It's a bureaucracy. What's a bureau? It's a piece of furniture for organizing your wardrobe, which was invented during the Enlightenment. People in the 1600s didn't have a sock drawer, by the way. Somebody invented that in the 1700s. It's for rational organization of things. And what is AT&T? It's a giant structure for the rational organization of resources, people, money, and processes, right? So put it in a dresser. Give it a sock drawer. Johnson also designed this building in Pittsburgh. This is the headquarters of the PPG Glass Company. If you've looked in the lower corner of your automobile windows, you might find their logo there. They build the glass that the modern skyscrapers and the auto industry use, but it looks like a cathedral, doesn't it? Or a castle. It's very Gothic, right? He's playing with historical styles, but also telling you something about the company. A cathedral of glass for my empire of glass. The Centre Pompidou, which is an art museum in the middle of Paris. It's kind of an elaborate joke of a building. It's turned wrong side out. The architects decided to take all the stuff that we normally hide behind the walls of a modern building and hang them on the outside. And basically, they're like, modern buildings are supposedly so honest and so pure, they hide an awful lot of stuff. All the heating, all the electric, all the plumbing, all the structural supports are all hidden behind these clean curtain walls of glass, stainless steel, white concrete. An honest building would actually look like this. There's all the plumbing, there's the HVAC, there's the stairs, the elevators, structures. It's playful, right? And one more set of playful buildings here. These are the best catalog showroom stores that were built across a couple of decades in the US. The term big box is one we all know, right? When we think of Walmarts and Targets and so forth, best stores were some of the first big box stores. And so the architects decided to play with that motif, right? It's just a big box with an interesting facade. Well, this facade is peeling off. Perhaps it's been in the sun too long. This one seems to be deteriorating right in front of us. This one's just cantilevered for fun. This one's particularly fun because that chunk there is actually the entrance to the store, and it's on a hydraulic system embedded in the sidewalk. So when the store is closed, it retracts into the space and seals off the corner. So you can drive by and say, they're open, they're closed, they're open, they're closed. And then one more, they built a false storefront and then planted a forest and then built the actual store behind it. And so when you walk through that first entry, the doors open and you're in the woods. And you have to walk down this little sidewalk and then another set of doors open and you're in the store itself. I think it might explain why they went out of business, because I'm thinking if I drive into that parking lot and see that building, I think, man, I'm like 20 years too late to shop here. Nature is reclaiming the building as we speak, right? I'm going to skip a few examples to keep things going for time's sake. Where this impulse in postmodern architecture is perhaps most riotous right now is in Dubai, cities like Shanghai, China, all across the Arab Emirates. They have so much money. It's an architect's playground. You can build buildings there they would never allow you to build anywhere else. And so there's just these ridiculous structures going up left and right. The Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building, at least until Saudi Arabia completes the Kingdom Tower in the city of Jeddah on the shore of the Red Sea, which is under construction as we speak. These amazing forms. This is a 7-star hotel. They had to revamp the ranking system to account for its luxury. It's kind of obscene, right? There's a whole new art museum complex in Abu Dhabi. That's a new Guggenheim museum. This is a new Louvre museum. This is a new performing arts center designed by Zaha Hadid. Here's a museum about the life of the guy who's financing the whole thing. He's a falconer. He loves some falcons, so they made it look like a bunch of falcon feathers. It's just ridiculous amounts of money pouring into mind-blowingly amazing projects. But it's causing some concern for architects who are like, I thought we were trying to design to make life better. And there's serious questions about access. There's serious questions about sustainability. There's serious questions about who enjoys these structures, who they're built for, at whose expense, the abusive labor practices in Abu Dhabi right now, mostly Filipino immigrants whose passports are confiscated, basically enslaved conditions, building these elaborate structures. The amount of concrete that's being poured is an environmental nightmare. So some architects are turning away from some of this Baroque excess and starting to think about context and the messages that our building tells and the stories they might tell us in a responsible way. So I'll give you a couple quick examples, and then we'll open for some discussion. This building in Prague, designed by Frank Gehry, was built on the site of an errant bomb that was dropped during World War II. An American bomber went off course, dropped a bomb where he shouldn't have, and that block stayed vacant until the 1990s. There was a design competition to design something new for that site, and Gehry won the competition for this building. It's now known as the Dancing House or Ginger and Fred. And you can see the sort of dancing couple of the silver screen, right? Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Think of them as this dancing pair in the middle. But if you look at the building as a whole, it's a building that's kind of shocked by violence, right? These row houses continue, and then you hit here and you have this sort of buckling wave of shock from that bomb getting dropped there. The windows are popping out of their sockets. It seems unfinished or shattered at the top. And Gehry said, look, we can't forget what happened here. We shouldn't just erase over it, put a clean glass structure here, and forget about the history of violence that visited this site. And so if you look at this top dome, I want you to see the connections of this structure to this one. This is the Peace Memorial in Hiroshima, Japan. This is a building that was reduced to these conditions by the atomic blast from another American bomber during that same campaign of war. And it's been retained in that condition as a reminder of what happened there and of the lives lost. Notice the structural similarities between them, right? Each sitting next to a bridge by the river, each with this unfinished dome on the top. Gehry wants to tell us that story, wants to remind us and let us not forget and be committed to nonviolence in the future. Another version of this is at the 9/11 Memorial in New York City. The foundations of the original building preserved as reflecting pools etched with the names of the victims. The transportation hub in the background here, designed by Santiago Calatrava, called the Oculus, is oriented at an odd angle relative to the other structures on the site, because on September 11th, at exactly 10:48 in the morning, which is the moment at which the second tower fell, the sun strikes right down through the center line of this building where he's created this long glass window and creates this shaft of light right through the center of this gleaming white structure as a reminder of hope and the possibilities of the future, a memorial every September 11th to the victims of that event. So architecture used to recall, to remember, to teach, to connect us to our context. There's a big movement of environmental buildings. So these are some of the green buildings literally being built around the world. These are known as the Vertical Forest in Milan. This is a new building called the Agora Garden in Taipei, Taiwan. Here's a hotel in Singapore. They've all incorporated living organisms as a carbon sink so that these buildings will absorb over their life more carbon than it required to construct them. And affordable housing is getting a lot better than Pruitt-Igoe. This is a newer project in the Bronx. It's completely carbon neutral, has a green roof, sustainable infrastructure. It's the cost of living there is within reach of every member of the city. There are community gardens, shared play spaces, colorful environments to share, multiple floor plans, recognizing the different living conditions that different people require instead of a one-size-fits-all approach. And it's been a wildly successful project. So what I'd like us to talk about in the time that we have left is, how do you think things are going to change? An architect by the name of Georgine Theodore said, when you have a momentary lapse of the status quo, it allows you to see that something's possible. So what do you think is possible right now? What are some of the trends that might continue? What are the fibers of the rope that might stay connected? What do you think will break? How do you think house design or city design might change because of COVID? What have we learned about ourselves?
To answer your question, the
Yeah.
city of the future will need far less office space.
Say that again.
The city of the future, after the pandemic, will need far more, at least far less office space,
Yeah.
more domestic working space.
Yes. Architects are already thinking about how to redesign. I mean, like the new homes that are being designed and will start to be built this year will have more bedrooms that could be repurposed as home offices. They'll be separated from each other in the floor plan, so they're not right next to each other for sound contamination between classrooms and office meetings happening in the home. So absolutely, we'll see that sort of redistribution of office environments into the home space.
I envision living spaces that allow one, even in the winter, to access, with protection of the indoor environment, direct sunlight for vitamin D.
Totally. So think about how Le Corbusier was thinking about that Villa Savoye. He's designing those big movable glass walls that could be closed off in inclement weather, but they're still open to the sunlight. That can be opened into an outdoor patio that's incorporated into the floor plan of the house. So yeah, recognizing our public spaces are not accessible to us in the way that they used to be. Or if they're going to be accessible, they need to be designed differently. Any thoughts on how public spaces might be designed differently?
Videos.
I think restaurants especially are going to be more outdoor. They're going to figure out a way of having almost year-round outdoor space.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an economic survival imperative for them now, right? And places like Vermont, it's going to be especially difficult. But we're seeing, I mean, we saw this in Burlington, right? This summer, a lot of the city streets were closed off to vehicle traffic, and we're there for social distanced walks for the neighborhood residents. Some of the major cities of the world have closed off their downtowns to automotive traffic and have set up restaurant seating across what used to be 4 lanes of busy traffic to allow for greater access to outdoor dining, greater access to outdoor socialization.
Yeah.
Perhaps that'll stay with us as a permanent feature.
Yeah, Burlington's Church Street was 40 years ahead of the time, right?
So true, so true.
And because we have finally, all of us, seen very clearly the social divisions that are along economic lines in our culture, what are we going to do about housing for people who don't have money?
So let's talk further about that. What has coronavirus revealed to us about ourselves? We've seen in all these other disease cycles that I talked about tonight, the same impulse circles around, right? Blame some other immigrant community, blame the poor, move them somewhere else, send our sewage downriver, build a wall to hide them from view. Are we going to do that again? I mean, we're seeing disparity, right, in terms of how COVID affects people of color versus white communities at greater rates with greater fatality. There are questions of access to the technology necessary to continue education at home or to work from home. Not every job can be done from home. I'm a food service employee or a janitor. I don't just get to clean my own home for pay and cook my own food, right? I have the luxury of being able to do my job as a professor and administrator from my home, but others can't. So how are we going to address these things?
What I'm noticing is that right now, this situation is making the housing prices in Vermont go up because we have people, anecdotally, we have people coming into Vermont who have money and they're escaping from where they think it's less safe to here. And they're paying what I consider outrageous prices for homes right around me that I wouldn't consider paying that much for that house.
Totally.
But you have to compare that to the fact that they're coming from New York City housing prices or something like that. And so what you're considering, and I consider an exorbitant price, is chump change to them. They're saying, oh man, look at this bargain I got.
Yeah.
And
But
we have to remember, sorry.
no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Nana.
I think we have to remember too, that as many of us are getting older and aging out of our houses, these people are the people that will keep the lights on at the State House
Mm.
in terms of tax contributions. So anyway, just throwing that in. That has
Yeah.
nothing to do with architecture.
Well, you know,
Yeah.
it's all connected, right?
But how is the ability of these people to pay outrageous prices for the better homes going to trickle down to the housing that is needed?
Through taxes.
Yeah, is it going to just raise everything up, and then there'll be even more people who can't afford it?
And that's the pattern, right? Is those who can't afford design an environment that is pure for themselves. They send the quote unquote contaminations somewhere else for someone else to deal with the problem.
As our guider or leader, I'm going to pose what your suggestions are to avoid gentrification, avoid the modern day versions of redlining. They're not formal in laws like they used to be, but we know that there are different neighborhoods that are those people don't live here sort of thing. Is this something that can come from government, from the architectural school or the educated leadership that you provide? How do we get it to come from the bottom up, and how do we get people to not want to destroy our sense of government and democracy and rather live together in peace?
You know, if I could answer your question, Reg, I'm in the wrong line of work for sure. Getting paid way too little.
Amen.
So, I mean, that is the question, right? And it's multifaceted. I mean, this is why I love teaching in an interdisciplinary context, is that architects alone can't solve it. Politicians alone can't solve it. Business owners alone can't solve it. It doesn't just boil down to any one of those issues. We've got to work together. The fact is, we've got good examples out there of how to do some of this well. And we have, especially in the last 30 years or so, developed some really engaged architecture practices that have nuanced responses to their urban context and to their primary users. So that example I showed you there in Bronx in the Bronx at the end, like, is a really successful project. And the design process by which that building came to be and was approved and funded is a model for how we could do it elsewhere in the world. If you want to read up on that, there's a lot to learn from that example. I think there's a political will question as to whether we'll actually choose that instead of protecting myself, embracing false notions of purity. So I think there's a philosophical dimension too, to actually sort of embrace what I'm calling contamination and to celebrate it, not disease itself, right? But think about how our immune systems work too, right? A vaccine is a form of contamination, right? You're getting an exposure to a version of the contaminant in order to develop immunity to it. Childhood exposure to a range of environments and experiences produces a robust immune system. So if we thought about, sort of political, economic, cultural, social immunity and purity differently, that's where I think we as educators can do some work to work with a emerging generation to think differently. But it's a multifaceted thing.
I was struck by how, at the beginning of your talk, the focus was really on architecture changing in response to a problem. And later, at the end, it was architecture responding to wealth and the freedom of wealth.
Yeah.
And that there's a great disparity there. Like, what we design early is basically to keep us going. What we design later is what we're allowed to do. And it was very stark. And I kept wondering, are we going to go back to architecture that expresses a problem, a solution to a problem, rather than this great creative outburst, you know?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. And two things occurred to me in response. One is, don't overinterpret my presentation. Like, it might have been the result of my choice of examples, right? Because alongside these crazy things going up in Dubai and that sort of thing, there is what we call vernacular architecture, right? There's humble, there's public school buildings and libraries, there's private residences and affordable housing complexes. And they are very much, you know, the sort of architectural practice that focuses on the problem. Architecture itself gets sort of enamored as a practice of these giant commissions, and, you know, the rock star global celebrity architect is a very large figure in the last half century, at least. Ever since Mies van der Rohe and others really sort of claimed that they could solve us. That's become a kind of emblematic pursuit. And it's generated intense wealth for those who do it. So I do think, you know, to your question, is there a return? I think that's one of the outcomes of this, that it could be pushing us to look back at vernacular architecture again. Because that one-size-fits-all solution, what's ironic about it is that while it sort of mimics the form of the hospital and partakes of the symbolism of purity, it's actually made it harder to combat our current situation. You can't open the windows in a skyscraper.
Right.
So, you know, if you're in an open floor plan, cubicle farm sort of office environment on the 45th floor of a high rise, your ventilation is completely mechanical, right? So you are in a very artificial, ostensibly pure, but perhaps exacerbating the impurities sort of environment. Whereas you look at, say, the old buildings in New Orleans, lots of balconies, big louvered open door windows, high ceilings with paddle fans. Like, they're built for the Southern context, built for hot, humid weather, and they handle it without mechanical devices.
One follow-up, you know, we just read today about how Vermonters anyway are connecting more to nature. You're getting out more. And I was wondering if this would play out, that the architecture would allow us to get outdoors more easily, more quickly to our immediate environment.
So yeah, in the public space domain, there's a lot of talk about redesigning parks to be accessible in a distanced fashion. There's some kind of interesting proposals out there for how we could rethink our urban shared spaces. There's thinking about the redesign of the urban fabric itself so that everything is walkable. You know, no matter where you might live in a large city, everything you would need is walkable for you in a 15-minute radius or something. Your work, your shopping, your childcare, your social life. So yeah, it's causing us to rethink our commitments to large-scale commutes, sort of high density office and retail spaces, and residential spaces for that matter. How many of those will take hold long term? I don't know. I think the flight from the city narrative that played out early in the pandemic is proving false. The data just don't support that. People are leaving New York to come to Vermont, but it's like for a second home, you know. We'll ride out the pandemic in safe little Vermont, and then we'll go back to New York.
And go back.
Or people are moving to New York from Denver, or, you know.
Urban villages, and when you said that, I mean, I think that's what you're describing in my thinking. Also, I think could help resolve some of the environmental issues regarding long commutes and use of petrols.
Definitely. And, you know, the US has kind of abandoned its investment in the public arena. We've let private interests dictate what gets built there. And they don't always have genuine public social well-being in mind, right? So just think about the availability of public bathrooms. and especially as we've, navigated the pandemic, the need for bathrooms without doors, like in an airport, those are only found in private spaces for the most part. And for us to properly get out and experience the public or nature, we need that kind of infrastructure. Likewise, investments in digital infrastructure for that continuation of education and work from home or work remotely. That becomes an equity and an access concern, I think, perhaps parallel to the investment in sewers and drinking water systems in the 1850s and 60s, right? It was seen as an urgent necessity for the public good, not private interest alone. It was a both and. And perhaps we'll start to look at investments in the digital infrastructure in the same way through the lens.
Yeah, don't you think there's a parallel that we need to look at in comparing the rural electrification projects that brought electricity to remote places like Vermont? If you study our history, we were pretty isolated and pretty out of touch and old fashioned, if you will. But we need that same kind of energy and effort put forward now on getting that last outreach for internet connections and all of the technological electronic sort of stuff that is needed, as you say, for education, for business, for more people to be able to work without having to drive so far and things of that sort.
Yeah, absolutely. Rural electrification is a great comparison. Another one of those large scale infrastructure projects taken on for the public good. Federal highways might be another, although every one of these, of course, is a double-edged sword that has intended or unintended negative effects too. I think we've also seen that schools are a site for more than just education. We've realized the degree to which those were networks for food distribution, for mental health, for physical care, not just learning. So how we rethink the architecture of our schools and their mode of embedding into our urban and rural fabric, I think is something for us to pay attention to coming out of this.
And Vermont, with our pretty wide open lack of density throughout the state, can be a model for more farm to table, more farmers markets, have the schools using a lot more local foods and things of that sort that can build out a more complex, I was going to say, but a more cohesive sense of place.
Definitely. Well, what else are you thinking about? What else are you wondering about? Any further thoughts or questions about anything I presented or our conversation here?
What's your thought in terms of the building, not so much the architecture, but the design of towns, communities, where we see new building? How is it? I mean, I'm thinking back, we talked about, okay, say Levittown, which provided all this housing for post-World War II people, and this was a big thing, but of course it was strictly no blacks were allowed to buy in Levittown. It was a pure white, us versus them kind of situation. How do you see the towns? I live in Bennington, and we're sort of a small town. People that I talk to are utterly amazed that for most of my lifetime, until ex-urban Burlington grew more, Bennington was always the third largest town in the state, and we had a population of 18,000. Now we're about 16,000. That Burlington is our largest city and has 45,000 people. It's we're a different environment, but if we're going to have growth and change, we need, somebody made the comment, we need to bring some more of those people from the city here to keep providing tax monies and to grow our population. Everybody always talks about keeping our young people here and not letting them flee and things like that. Do you have any thoughts on where this is going as far as not only the urban center and in the greater Burlington area, but in the smaller towns and the little tiny places throughout the state.
Yeah, I mean, if we carry with us out of this current crisis an openness to remote work, that could really work in favor of smaller towns in Vermont that might see an influx of people who want to experience the loveliness of Vermont and work from afar. I know our politicians were trying to woo people here with $10,000 grants for the last couple of years to get people to work remotely from Vermont. We may not have to spend tax dollars to do it. How that develops out, I mean, Burlington has a housing stock shortage. I don't know if Bennington and other places face a similar challenge, but I guess I'll say what I think shouldn't happen is that the sort of planned communities you referenced with Levittown, the overt racism of that is certainly its own problem. But I think the starkly planned communities, even if you could do so without the extra problem of racism, still feel like an imposition on the organic growth that sort of is what is part of the appeal of these small towns, right? So I'd take you back to where we started with that notion of the palimpsest, right? The continuously rewritten document. It's not a perfectly cleaned page with perfectly typed Bauhaus font, once for all, forevermore. It's going to keep changing, and it's going to keep getting written on in new ways. So I'd be in favor of smaller scale projects that integrate affordability, mixed use communities. Again, that notion of walkability seems important. But the perfectly planned community has not proven to work yet. So I hope we don't go that route.
One thing I would wonder about, as mentioning Levittown, one of the stereotypes about Levittown was that you could go to the wrong house because they all look the same. I'm wondering if it's true now. You know, it's 60 years, well, it's more than 60 years since they built Levittown. Now, my daughter lives in an Alexandria, Virginia neighborhood where there is basically two styles of houses. And I walked around the neighborhood and counted 100 houses in her basic style, but none of them look the same anymore, because they've been there long enough that people have done something to one end. You know, it's all been altered.
Yeah. I guess a Google Street Map would probably answer that question for us to see what it looks like now. I would guess it probably hasn't changed a ton, but they're probably less uniform than they used to be. I would imagine there are some covenants that prevent too much radical rebuilding.
Well, it was, you know, how far you are from the next house is to what determined how much you could rebuild.
Very much so, yeah.
David, is the current decline in tradespeople, people going into trades, impacting building at all?
I'm not sure. You would think it would eventually, right? I mean, I know from my own efforts to do home renovations here in Burlington, finding a contractor can be ridiculous hunt for like they have more work and they don't need your job is my experience more often than I wish. So yeah, the more shortage there is, the harder it's going to be to find qualified tradespeople.
On the other hand, you have the increasing development, and again, it's the industrial solutions to things going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. But much more housing today is prefabricated and built basically in a, if you want to say, like the old production line sort of thing, and then packaged, driven out to the site. And instead of a stick-built house, and my uncle and my cousin were great builders and they're wonderful production. But nowadays you put the house up in about a week. You have the groundwork laid, you have the foundation poured, and then you come in and boom, you have the house, and a week later the people can move in. Whereas with stick built, you've got to go step by step by step, and it's a few people doing the work. So there's a difference in housing construction. I think more of our problem is going to be, you talk about the tradespeople, is getting a hold of a plumber who will come out and fix your leak, or you know, that kind of repair. The plumber, the electrician, the roofer, the things that are needed fixing up as opposed to the initial construction.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of talk right now about modularity as something we need to do more of, especially with healthcare. If you followed the news through the pandemic of hospital overcrowding, there were some rapid efforts to repurpose sort of adaptive reuse of existing spaces, including large arenas that became hospital sites. In I forget which city in China, they built an entire new hospital in 10 days.
And they build it in like 2 weeks.
Yeah, it was 10 days. And so there's the notion that we need to learn better methods of modularity and flexibility and adaptive reuse so that we can respond more quickly to whether it's another pandemic or an environmental crisis. Our spaces themselves should be flexibly modular so that we can repurpose a space for an office instead of sitting at the kitchen counter for a year. You know, those sort of concerns that were part of some of the original modernist thinking, but kind of lost along the way. So those might be reclaimed.
How are your young students of college age thinking about these kinds of issues as far as housing and society and where we're going?
My sense is right now they're trying to figure out how to survive another semester of classes like this, right? Not part of what we do. And I just noticed one of my colleagues is on the call, so he can jump in on this too. But part of what we do is pose them with these sorts of complex problems to help them develop the skills for thinking through and responding to these. But I think it's still rather hypothetical for them at the scale that I was exploring tonight. It feels, you know, the hyper-local version of that for them is, am I staying at home with my parents, or am I going to risk living in the dorm? Am I going to get out of bed and put on pants to go to class, or am I just going to sit my laptop in my bed and go to class that way? Those are perhaps the more urgent. Or am I going to be able to travel to our campus in Montreal or Dublin? Can I do an internship? That's where they start to intersect with the more global concerns. Jonathan, I see you on the call, and Wei Ling. Hi, good to see you both. Anything to add?
Oh, I teach classes on urban studies at Champlain, and something called urban humanities that ask many of these questions. So I'll be building courses with Dave and other folks that address this stuff in active ways. Nice to meet all of you, and great talk, Dave. Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question that I just want to throw in here before I sense we're closing out. But a preoccupation of mine is collaborative planning. And it is particularly important to me as this pandemic unfolds and we see whole sectors of the economy and of the culture that have not been brought into planning. And one of them, as I have just turned 80 last May, is the incredible wealth of knowledge and energy and willingness of people my age and older, the very, very old, who are still of sound mind and quite physically capable. What is going to happen in cultures that will bring in collaborative solutions from all these diverse sectors of society?
We just need to build the right building.
I was thinking you might have an idea.
Basically, I'll throw out the idea that we are living examples of it right now.
That was exactly what I was thinking while she was talking, yeah.
Yeah, because normally I love to go to First Wednesdays, and the one I can get to is Manchester. It's only a half-hour drive to get there. But for me to be able to go today, as I did, to the humanities website and say, okay, which first Wednesday do I want to attend today? And choose this one. But not only that, and I'm not quite as elderly, I'm only 79, but I am speaking to you from my condo in Vero Beach, Florida. And so we are living examples of using this technology to expand into a much broader sense of learning. I wish I was 19 instead of 79 and could take David's course up there and be able to, do this kind of thing on a daily basis. But at least I can do it now because of this possibility. And that's something that probably isn't going to change.
So I don't want to prolong the evening, but I do have a sort of a global thing here that about going back to your first thesis about the pandemic, about pandemics. This pandemic, I think, is just one of many that we're going to face, probably with increasing frequency. And it's really due to the large number of people on the earth, the intercommunication and transportation, the quick passing of viruses from one to another. Will that ultimately change not just architecture, but how we live? In other words, is it teaching us to stay closer to home, not reproduce as much, cherish our own little environment rather than living everywhere? That's a lesson I've been contemplating that the virus is trying to teach us. And maybe it can be reflected through how we structure our environment in years to come.
Yeah, my hunch is that similar questions were posed back in 1919, back in 1859. Each time a large portion of the population experienced this sort of decimation, and each time it was connected to global travel and this sort of thing, we've wondered this, and I think probably in the short term there is a curtailment that follows as people are somewhat hesitant. But over the last 100 years since the flu ravaged in 1918 and 19, global travel and population have exploded, right? So where will we be 100 years from now? My bet is we'll have found a new way to explode in those arenas.
Yeah.
But I want to come back to the question posed prior, and I have no wisdom to share when it comes to collective planning, but I'll put on my educator and educational administrator hat and say multi-generational education, I think, could be a first step in the right direction toward a community which has a greater sense of the value of its multiple constituents, so that the youth who are in high school and college see those who are in retirement as resources for their own education. And likewise, those in retirement have the opportunity to learn with and learn from those at different stages of life than themselves. So I would love to see, and we'll commit to working on a scheme by which we could all join one another with a bunch of 19-year-olds in a classroom as frequently as you would want to, because I think that would just simply be better for all of us educationally, and then that might actually cash out in terms of better city planning, better political decisions, lots of things. So that's where I'd start.
Well, that's good enough. That's good enough to put us on a bus to Burlington for class.
All right. Well, maybe it won't take a bus. As Reg has shown us, you can do this from Florida. So,
and in that vein, David, did you see the announcement from the Pope a couple of days ago, where he has decreed that we're to focus on what he referred to as the forgotten grandparent. And he is going to have, I believe it's the final Sunday in July, to be sort of an international recognition of grandparents and the role of that intergenerational situation and the wisdom and experience that they can bring to their grandchildren. So you and the Pope are on the same wavelength. Maybe you can get him on your class.
Excellent.
He
Get
can
him to
do it
teach
from
one.
Rome. If I can do it from Vero Beach, he can do it from Rome.
First Wednesdays with Francis. All right. Michelle, you have your marching orders. Well, thank you all for this lively conversation and for choosing to spend this time together.
Wonderful.
It was a great
I've had a lot of
Very
fun.
good.
Very good.
Very, very good.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much. It was a great evening.